All right, so why have we selected McCloskey's article, The Rhetoric of Economics, published in 1983, as part of the Seminal Papers series? What's so important about this article? Well, to answer that question, we need to have a little bit of background. Since the 19th century, economists, or what used to be known as political economists, have been particularly concerned about whether economics or political economy is a science or not, and the concomitant concern that it should be a science. But of course that raises the question of, well, what is it to be a science anyway? In the 20th century, you get the development of a distinct sub-discipline within philosophy, known as the philosophy of science, and that comes to be dominated by a particular school of thought known as logical positivism, or what later morphed into logical empiricism. By the 1960s, and certainly by the 1970s, this school of thought had been substantially delegitimized by a number of critics. Chief amongst those, I think, are Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Imre Lakatos, and Paul Feyerabend. Well, when I was at uni, they were the big four, so to speak, who were regarded as central to the ultimate decimation of this previously dominant school of thought within the philosophy of science. Now, in the late 1970s and early and throughout the 1980s, and even after that as well, you had economic methodologists who were champions of these sorts of views. So in the early 1980s, you had champions of a Popperian approach to understanding economics as a science. And you had others who advocated a Kuhnian approach, and still others who advocated a Lakatosian approach. No one, however, was willing to countenance a Feyerabendian approach, which suggested, or was, because it was tended to be dismissed as, well, this is just irrational, anything goes nonsense. It's not the basis for any serious understanding of economics, or any other discipline for that matter, as a science. McCloskey is, I think, the first serious, well-known champion of that view, that economics can be understood in Feyerabendian terms. So in that sense, the article is doing something new, both in terms of its substance, the arguments it's making, but also in terms of its style, which has a very Feyerabendian tinge to it, or hue to it, in that it's both strident, and it has a sense of humor about it. It's a bit playful as well. Now, McCloskey's article led to much heated debate in economic methodology, and perhaps is probably one of the best examples, ironically, of the use of strategic rhetoric itself. It was read very widely by both mainstream economists and heterodox economists who held different minority views on economic theory. And it sparked, for a while, it sparked a real critical examination of what people, in particular economists, thought that they were doing because it purported to lift the veil on the official rhetoric that economists used to justify their claims to scientific status. Didn't mean McCloskey was saying economics didn't have scientific status. But what she was arguing, in a kind of Feyerabend'ian way, was that what they thought science was, what they thought they were doing, was not, or what they were doing, wasn't what they thought they were doing. They were misinterpreting their own practices to some extent. And once they realized that, then they could improve on them. In any case, the article was very widely read, led to much heated debate, and it now has many citations. I think it's over 1,600 citations. There were both defenses of the article and the subsequent book, which came out a couple of years later, of the same title. And there was also quite ferocious criticism at times, just straight up ad hominem criticisms that were made too. Well, whatever was the case, whichever side people came down on, there weren't really very many fence-sitters, and there weren't very many people who read that and responded by a yawn. It wasn't that kind of article. It sparked people's imaginations and their emotions. You had conservative methodologists who were sticking to something closer to a traditional positivist understanding of science, who felt that McCloskey's article was opening the door to a kind of irrational radicalism in economics, where anything could go. On the other hand, you had more radical methodologists who saw in McCloskey's article a salve for a kind of irrational conservatism in economics. That is, where McCloskey's article, it was argued, was in some sense allowing everything in economics to just continue as it was before, that there was nothing wrong and everything was fine. In some sense, it was kind of an excuse maker. So you had, amongst the critics, radically different views. So this helps to explain probably why it has garnered so many citations. I suppose the question for us now is, has this article, written in 1983, way back when most of you were either just becoming conscious or maybe weren't even born, whether it's had a lasting influence on the economics profession. I think McCloskey's own verdict is that it hasn't really had a substantial lasting influence, or that it had much of an influence at all. I think that judgment is overly pessimistic. I won't say modest, because as far as I can tell, McCloskey doesn't strike me as an unduly modest person. But so I think her view is perhaps just a bit pessimistic. It's certainly the case that it has had some influence, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, quite directly, I think. For example, I remember a time, let me get out my walking stick, I remember a time when in seminar rooms where people would be giving papers, that it kind of became a bit fashionable to say that we're telling a story here, that economists are storytellers. That's kind of, and that's directly coming from McCloskey, there's no doubt about that. Now, that kind of talk is died off a bit now, but for a time, that was a direct influence. And it did lead to a kind of, for at least a while, and maybe it's persisted over time, a concern that through all of the mathematical gymnastics that an economist will go through, they should nonetheless be able to talk about the intuition behind the mathematics. That is, what's the story going on behind the mathematics there? And I think that McCloskey can claim some credit for that. I think it's certainly true that McCloskey's article has contributed to a greater recognition of the importance of fallible abductive reasoning and of analogical reasoning by means of analogy. Now, it's true, as McCloskey says, that that's kind of always been there, but it's never been really recognized as entirely legitimate or entirely necessary. And I think today that's something that's a bit more accepted, that reasoning by analogy has an acceptable status to some extent today. This is not to say that at base, formal deductive reasoning, for theorization especially, and a rigorous kind of inductive reasoning, especially associated with econometrics, doesn't rule the roost anymore. They absolutely do. But a space has been carved for abductive and analogical reasoning, I think. And these were ideas that were championed in McCloskey's article. And finally, I think we see evidence of the influence of McCloskey's work, and this is not necessarily via citation anymore, it's just something that's kind of seeped in to the economics profession. And that is the way in which models are talked about now. Very often, maybe not very often, but more often than used to be the case, models are often thought of in terms of a metaphor. So the model is metaphorical. Rather than thinking of the older terminology which was sometimes used, which was a theory is a map of the world. Now you tend to find the model is a metaphor for some real world phenomenon. So there is that change in terminology, and it might be more than just a change in terminology, that there is some semantic change that's occurred by thinking of models as metaphors, in that they are in some way, quote unquote, telling lies. That is, you can't take them, they're not literally true, but they have within them a truth that's not understood in literal terms. It refers to something in reality, but not in descriptive not as a way of literally describing reality. And in that respect, one might say that there is some link back, ironically, to the work of Milton Friedman with his Methodology of Positive Economics article from 1953. Because it's arguable that Friedman was saying something similar, but without using the word metaphor. where he's saying X behaves as if it were Y, which is a metaphorical way of speaking. So there's something of a connection back to the past, and McCloskey's retaining that and kind of ramping it up and giving it a new terminology.